Photoshop is a great place to create designs to animate in After Effects, and a big part of making that go smoothly is taking the time to set them up properly in Photoshop first. So let's talk about how and why to prep your Photoshop files before sending them to After Effects. The techniques we'll be covering should work with pretty much anything you can create in recent versions of Photoshop and After Effects. But if you'd like to follow along, you can download my example files for free. Just follow the link in the description. Whether you're working with someone else's designs or creating them yourself, the way you work in a design app when the pieces need to move can be quite a bit different than when they don't. Even the coolest looking design with the tidiest Photoshop organization will probably need some restructuring before it goes to After Effects, because it's just a different way of thinking about the pieces you have to work with. In our recent tutorial covering the different ways you can import a Photoshop file into After Effects, we used a file that was pretty ideally set up, but getting to that point means understanding what you're aiming for and why. So let's work through restructuring an existing design, look at some other potential issues you might run into, and learn some helpful tips for keeping this process as smooth as possible. This design was originally created for print and web uses, but then the client decided they also wanted it animated. I already see several things I'd like to do with this file, but the very first and arguably most important step is to come up here to File, Save As, and add something like 2AE to the file name. Now we're working on our own separate version of the file, and we'll always have the original one to go back to if we need it. This also makes it clear which version of the file we'll later be importing into After Effects, because it's right there in the name. Next up, check out the current dimensions of this thing. It's way bigger than we need it to be, and this much resolution is meaningless for what we're doing. Let's go up to Image, Image Size. First thing is the resolution. Anything above 72 ppi is totally unnecessary when this is just going to screens, so let's change that to 72. Our client said this should be a 1200 by 1200 animation, so let's go ahead and size this down. There will be times you want to keep this bigger than the actual frame size, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, time for another really important step. Let's export a reference image before we start messing with anything else. You can use whatever method you like. I'll just do this one, Quick Export as PNG. Sometimes the restructuring we'll be doing might change the appearance of some layers, so it'll be good to have this reference when we bring this into After Effects later. Next up, this file is still in CMYK, which you'll see a lot with designs that were built for print. After Effects and any other video creation app only works with RGB, so we'll need to change that too. You can do that here in the Properties panel or under Image, Mode. Photoshop is going to warn me that I should merge and rasterize stuff, but I like to keep everything editable if I can. There are times where this may change the appearance of some layers slightly, so that's why we exported that reference before doing this. Double checking the color mode is very important because After Effects will not import a CMYK file properly or often at all. These are the steps you should do every single time. Make your own copy of the file and name it clearly. Make yourself a reference export. Resize the file so it's not way bigger than it needs to be, and confirm you're in the right color mode. Good? Good. From here, things get squishier because it's more about what's in your design file and how you're planning to animate it. Let's revisit that resizing we just did. I noticed that all the images in this file are smart objects, which means we still have access to the original images at full size, regardless of how big this specific Photoshop file is. If your design contains rasterized or flattened layers, you may want to keep this bigger than the final animation frame size to give yourself more flexibility. Just like Photoshop, After Effects works with pixels, and if you scale something above 100%, it's going to start looking bad. So if there's even a possibility that you'll want to scale up any of the elements in your design, you might want to keep the entire file bigger. Of course, this means the file size will also be bigger, and After Effects may have to work a little harder when you're animating, so you'll have to find that balance. While you do have to be mindful about scaling, depending on how you import, you can potentially give yourself access to the full untrimmed layers even if they extend outside the Photoshop canvas, so that's another helpful thing to keep in mind here. You're probably catching on that you have to start thinking about how you might want to animate this design before you're even in After Effects. Obviously, that can seem like a lot if you're still new to this, but don't panic. Even if you've been doing this for a long time, you're still going to change your mind sometimes, or get partway through an animation and realize you should have built an element in a slightly different way. That's okay, and with experience, you'll get a feel for what works best. That's also why we kept our original file, why we made a reference export, and why you should try to keep your Photoshop files flexible and non-destructive whenever possible. One of the places you'll really feel the importance of proper structuring is in the way you have your layers grouped. When this gets imported, it maintains this same layer structure, but what are folders in Photoshop become pre-compositions in After Effects. They're similar, but in some ways, pre-comps are almost more like smart objects, in that they aren't really immediately accessible without actually diving into them, in a way that leaves you unable to see the other parts of your project structure. So while it might totally make sense to have top-level groups like text and art here in Photoshop, you probably want to eliminate these extra levels of grouping, leaving more elements easily accessible as individual pieces. And you'll be able to see everything together in context in After Effects. Here in After Effects, you can also handle a lot of the things Photoshop groups do in more flexible ways. You can connect layers so they move together, called parenting, without hiding them away in a pre-comp. And there are all kinds of flexible ways to use masks and mats and copy and even link these together. And you can always pre-compose these groups of layers later if you decide that's what you want. Plus, these pre-compositions can be easily duplicated in different ways, giving multiple layers that all point back to the same thing, similar to a smart object, or you can make discrete versions that vary from one another. There's no easy built-in way to unpre-compose though, so you want to be thoughtful when doing this. Generally speaking, if you have a group of layers that you know can really just function as one thing, like these little bars with the social media handles, those are probably fine to leave in a Photoshop group. But when in doubt, fewer groups is probably better. Of course, whatever structure you do make is going to be a lot easier to work with if you take the time to properly name everything, so let's do that. The images included in your design can be another big decision point. Let's check out these guitars, for example. You can see here I've masked off part of that layer. Let's double-click this to open up the original and see what we've got. Okay, interesting. More guitars we can potentially work with. In animation, you're not just thinking about the single image you were given, but sometimes how you might get to that image. Maybe it would be cool to scroll past a few other guitars before we land on the featured ones. Would you want to be able to move these as 3 separate groups for that? They're on white, so it would be pretty easy to slice this into 3 major pieces, and I bet it would be pretty easy to make a clean plate out of this wall. But then you start wondering, well, looking at the 3 guitars in our approved image, is there any reason to separate those? Would we want the ability to move them, even subtly, as 3 separate objects? If so, then we need to cut each of them out individually, and probably even come in here, carefully cut around this tuner, and clone in the portion of the fretboard behind it. Would we need to paint in the little pieces of this shadow then? This is why it's important to have some kind of plan. This can be a lot of work or very little, depending on what you need to do with it. So unless you just love doing cutout and cloning work, you might try to start simple, and then you can come back in here and tackle that stuff if you decide you need it. If you want some tips on the best ways to get great cutouts here in Photoshop, Joey recently dropped another tutorial all about that, so check it out. For my animation, I decided I would like these all broken out. So you can see I've got a clean version of the wall I made using Content-Aware Fill, these 2 groups, and then the 3 main guitars, each on their own layers. I cloned in that area of the base, layered this other one on top of that, and then I have another layer for the shadows that need to sit behind the base. Notice I did almost all of this using layer masks, so I can come back and keep editing these if I need to, and I haven't destroyed or lost anything in the process. Oh, and here at the bottom, I have the most important layer of all, the copy I made of the original image before I started chopping anything up. In this case, I'd make sure to resize this image to something reasonable and probably just import this into After Effects as its own layered Photoshop file. You can always reassemble things in After Effects as long as you give yourself all the right pieces. And of course, then you can use those pieces to make the awesome animations you're after. If you're still learning the ins and outs of After Effects, you should check out our After Effects Kickstart course. It's a comprehensive interactive course that will get you really comfortable working in After Effects in just a handful of weeks, whether you're brand new or even if you've already got a bit of experience but have realized you still need to learn some of the fundamentals. Let's talk just a bit more about structuring your Photoshop files before bringing them over to After Effects, whether you're working with your own designs or someone else's. Working with artboards is very useful when you're designing for multiple aspect ratios or laying out a set of storyboards. After Effects doesn't really recognize artboards though, so we'll have to separate these out into individual files, after you've properly named them and made reference exports, of course. With storyboards, it may be common to have multiple frames that are important for design approval, but may essentially be the same from an animator's perspective. Look for opportunities where you might be able to combine frames that use most of the same elements just to save yourself a bit of importing and setup later. Once you're happy with everything, come up to File, Export, Artboards to Files. You'll get a few options, and then Photoshop will save each of these out as their own layered PSD, ready to be imported to After Effects. Linked files and smart objects are a great way to keep things editable when working in Photoshop, but you'll have times you'll need access to the original element. Here in this document, I have a linked Illustrator file. Importing this into After Effects gives me this layer, but only as flattened pixels. In this case, I'd want to open up the original file by double-clicking it in my Photoshop layer panel, save it as its own separate file if it's not already, and then import that element separately into After Effects, giving access to the full size or layers that I might need for the animation. You may need to make some adjustments to match the size and positioning you originally used in Photoshop. The difference blending mode is really helpful here. I'll make sure my modes column is visible. If you see switches instead, you can click down here or hit the F4 key to toggle between these. And then if I set this layer's blending mode to difference, it gives you this great utility view where anything that's exactly the same is pure black and anything different is shown as white. Now I can adjust this until it's just perfect, set this layer back to normal, and delete the flattened copy because I don't need that anymore. Using imported textures is another very common use case here, and if you want more flexibility in After Effects, remember to keep them as links or smart objects when you're working in Photoshop. It's not uncommon to find that you may need to resize or even tile a texture to give you enough to animate, so try to keep that in mind when designing. If you're creating more textures yourself, that's another time to really think about what you'll need for the animation. Here I have a bit of texture I painted to apply onto this circle. Let's take a look at how this is built. I have one layer with some highlights and one with some shadows, both using blending modes. If I don't want the ability to move these textures independently, that might be fine. But if I release these clipping masks, you'll see I don't really have any options here if I want the textures to do anything besides just stick to the circle. Here's a different approach to the same look where I've extended the texture way beyond the circle, and I actually made every brushstroke its own separate layer. In After Effects, I can still trim these to only show within the circle, just like we did in Photoshop. But now I have the ability to animate every single stroke separately if I want to, creating a much more interesting and complex look. Since we have access to all the individual brushstrokes as separate elements, that also gives us the ability to reuse these in other parts of the project if we want. Sure, this will be overkill in many cases, but as an animator, I'd rather have the choice. At the very least, try to keep track of which brushes you're using in case you need to extend or recreate something later. Or it might be smart to quickly create an extra file where you just make a handful of strokes with any brush you're using, just in case it comes up later. Photoshop and After Effects do share a lot of functionality. Some features like text, layer styles, and adjustment layers transfer over perfectly, or at least pretty well, with just a few exceptions. Photoshop text comes over perfectly, and you can easily make it editable after you import it. Just select the text layer, then choose Layer, Create, Convert to Editable Text. Now you can change or animate this text. You probably like to use layer styles to spice up your text though, so let's see how those do. When importing a PSD into After Effects, you'll have an option to keep your layer styles editable or merge them into the layer. If you choose to keep them editable, you'll be able to change and even animate the properties, and most of the time this will work fine, but there are a couple exceptions you should know about. The biggest gotcha is that After Effects only allows one instance of each layer style. So if you use multiple strokes, for example, After Effects will only see the first one. When you run into the few other things that don't quite work out, like the extra options under Bevel and Emboss, After Effects will usually have its own solutions. For example, you have several perspective effects that can handle bevels and other similar looks, plus you can actually work in 3D space and even create extrusions in here. These blend if settings also don't transfer for some reason, but using the extract effect in After Effects will give you basically the same thing. You can easily stack effects in all kinds of creative ways in here, so you may realize certain looks will end up being easier to create in After Effects anyway. Lastly, if you've imported your layers with merged styles and later change your mind, you can actually still make them editable by coming up to Layer, Layer Styles, Convert to Editable Styles. Almost all the adjustment layers you can add in Photoshop will also transfer over, and they actually convert directly to editable effects, sometimes with the same interface. If you like to use levels or hue and saturation, for example, the adjustments you make in Photoshop can be imported, so each of these will now be their own adjustment layer in After Effects. And you'll see the levels and hue saturation effects have already been added. If I click on one, you'll see the settings I used in Photoshop came right over. Now I can change them or even animate these values. As far as I can tell, all of these will transfer except Color Lookup and Gradient Map. Gradient Map can actually be replaced by a variety of effects depending on the look you need. Tint, Tritone, CC Toner, Colorama, or there's another solution that's also a fix for Color Lookup. Let's say I have a very specific gradient map that's already been approved. I don't plan to animate anything about the way these colors are applied, and I don't want to try to recreate it with other effects. I can actually export this as a LUT to use in After Effects. First, this image needs to have a background for this to work. I'll just use this guitar layer. Layer, New, Background from Layer. Now I'll come over to File, Export, Color Lookup Tables. I'll set these grid points to high or maximum, and then save this as a cube or 3DL file. In After Effects, that gradient map adjustment layer just came in empty, but I can come over to the Effects and Presets panel and search for Lumetry. Grab this Lumetry color effect and drag it onto my layer. Now I'll come up to the Effect Controls panel, look under Basic Correction, Input LUT, Browse. Now we can choose the LUT we just created or any other LUT we'd like to use. Not every feature will transfer or convert easily, of course. Let's check out a few more common Photoshop techniques that may require a bit more work or even rebuilding to get the kind of editability you might want after transferring to After Effects. When working with vector shapes, whether you can use what you built in Photoshop will depend largely on what you want to do with it. Here I've made a simple rectangle and circle just as an example. In Photoshop I can still edit these paths and can change some of the properties. When you import a filled shape into After Effects, it basically just becomes a layer of solid color with a mask that trims it to that shape. You can edit or animate the mask, which works fine for simple stuff. Unfortunately, shapes with a stroke just come in flattened, and you really can't do anything else besides just move the whole layer itself. After Effects actually has its own vector tools called shape layers, which have a lot more functionality. These have a ton of options though, so they can be kind of overwhelming at first. But if you want access to the same kind of parametric controls, where you can edit the shape with specific number values instead of just eyeballing a path, and if you want to be able to easily edit or even animate the fill and stroke, you're going to want to rebuild them using these shape layers. The masking features can also be a mixed bag depending on how much flexibility you need in animation. Clipping masks, where you use one layer to control the visibility of portions of another layer, actually transfer over pretty smoothly. They do end up nested within their own pre-composition, and personally there are different ways I would rather build this in After Effects, but it does work and it does look just like it did in Photoshop. Using a layer mask, like I have here, that transfers over just fine, but that mask is now baked into the layer, so we'll have no way to change or animate it in After Effects. This also changes the boundaries of this layer as far as After Effects is concerned. Notice the difference in the layer size between the masked and unmasked versions? Putting a layer mask on a group of layers is also pretty common. Here I've done some masking so this text sits behind part of this other layer. Unfortunately, After Effects just doesn't see this at all. The best solution here, or if you need a single layer's mask to stay editable, is actually to create a dummy layer. I usually use a color solid. Alt or Option drag to copy the mask to this dummy layer, and then disable the mask on the original layer. Now when we import into After Effects, we can use some of its compositing features to get the same look. In this case, I'm using track mats. So here we're using a second layer to hold that masking information, which means we can move or animate it separately from the original layer. As you've seen, After Effects will often have the same functionality, but with a different name or maybe a slightly different approach. Ultimately, if you ever run into trouble importing something that just doesn't look right, remember that if you don't need that editability or flexibility for a particular layer or group, don't overcomplicate it. You can always rasterize a layer, merge layers together, or pack something away as a smart object, as long as you keep an editable copy of the layers or the whole file. Maybe it makes sense to combine what might be several layers in Photoshop, if it's really just going to act as a single object in your animation. Take the time to think about the pieces you have, or that you can make from what you have, and if that's what you need to get the animation you want. So it's not uncommon for the prepped version of your Photoshop file to look pretty different than the original design, because you know that you're just making sure you have the right pieces so you can structure this properly when you get to After Effects. Hopefully these tips help you build your files in a more animation-friendly way, and you can spend less time struggling with importing and more time making cool designs and even cooler animations. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for even more design and animation tips. Head over to schoolofmotion.com to learn more about our interactive online curriculum, and let our team know if you have any questions at all. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.